Right, so we're going to continue to unravel developments as investigations into the fire that obviously broke out at a building in the Johannesburg CBD, killing at least 74 people. That investigation continues. For now, SABC News reporter Hasina Gori has been on the ground since this morning and joins me in studio to unpack further. Hasina, I dare say good afternoon. It's been a traumatic day.
It's been a heavy day.
Perhaps overnight as well. We've seen the developments. We're still waiting the investigations into the cause of it. But from your vantage point, having immersed yourself in the reality of what transpired, perhaps you could speak to the response from the inner city's disaster management team in a post-COVID era. What did you observe on the ground on that front?
I think that's quite interesting, specifically around in a post-COVID era. What we've seen is rapid response. Maybe it's also because we've come from, just the gas explosion that had just taken place as well, that our disaster relief and the different sectors that needed and stakeholders that needed to be called and come to the ground have come quite rapidly. We did not see a situation where communities have said that really fire engines took long, which was before the response that we'd get, from communities, that it took 3 or 4 hours. Emergency response services were on the ground. They were there. It took them quite a long time to put out that fire, about 2 hours. And then following that, search and rescue has, then begun. Also today, when we were at the forensic pathologist, we asked them around the DNA as well as capacity when it came to keeping the bodies. It's 74 bodies that are being kept. Do they have the space? And one of the things they said was that COVID had taught them how to deal with this number of tragedies. We saw that during the pandemic where fatalities were rising daily. So we've seen that post-COVID, we are seeing that the response teams are more activated, but also that all the different legs that need to be activated. So your humanitarian, your socio-economic, your socio-psycho teams, even your pastors and faith-based communities, each have been activated. We saw chaplains being, there at the centers. We saw counseling being given, because these are all needed. It's a traumatic, experience. People have lost lives, but also lost everything that they've had.
No, absolutely. And speaking about losing everything they had, a lot of the occupants in the area were traumatized before perhaps taking up space there. Perhaps you could speak to the perceptions that have emerged through the media and through the sentiments of the ground about the occupants. What did you actually observe? They are South Africans as well.
I think that was, quite something that we weren't seeing before. We'd expect that those that live within the inner city, those that lived in those hijacked buildings, were foreign nationals, they were refugees, undocumented, or what we'd call illegal migrants, and those were necessarily those type of people that we see. But also internal migration within South Africa has seen many people move from various different provinces coming into these, city of gold for, the richest square mile in Africa, and where our economic hub is. And many come here to look for opportunity and find that maybe they do not have enough money to rent a space in a safe space, and they end up in these vulnerable positions where they're paying 1,200 Rand for a room that is not really necessarily a flat, but a room within an empty space that has been cordoned off to create, a kind of housing situation. And we saw that family members I spoke to, the ones that were from South Africa, came from KZN, northern KZN specifically. One was from Newcastle. We've heard, people from Nkandla, as far as that, where 3 sisters passed on today. And of them, the one sister was a nurse and one was a teacher. Yesterday, the lady that we spoke to, whose brother had been missing, her brother was a lawyer who is now working at a company, not practicing as a lawyer, but as a professional. So it's not the perception that these are people that do not have jobs, they're unemployed, they're uneducated. Specifically, there are different circumstances, and internal migration plays a huge role, as much as the external migration of people from our neighboring countries that also come into the space. So these all, that perception that it was just foreign nationals who don't have, jobs, or are just slumming because there's no other space, that notion has been, put to test. And the Gauteng province said that. They said that when they've been auditing these buildings that have been hijacked, they've found that people are paying rent. So they're able to pay rent, and it's 1,200 or 300 for one person. So if you're a family of 3, that might go up as well. So people are able to pay that. So these buildings can be rehabilitated, can be then rented out, and that money could go back into the city of Johannesburg. And these are options that they may have not considered before, or have plans that were never, seen as fruitful. And now these are conversations that can also be had.
Because the situation is nuanced. And so we've also seen sentiments from different parties, literally. And there's a blame game of sorts also unearthing. Joburg Property Association saying that they had accused the metro of, failing to reply or to respond to their pleas. What are you also observing on that front? There's a short-term issue, there's a long-term systemic issue that needs to be dealt with.
So the short-term issue, that's your first disaster relief. That was what we saw come out today. But that long-term systemic issue didn't start yesterday, it didn't start a year ago. I've been on the field for 11 years in Gauteng area, and this issue was here from the very beginning. Former Mayor Park Star, when the ANC administration was in power, already was lauded for his plans to rehabilitate the inner city, to take back these hijacked buildings, for them to become economic viable for the city to use, for them to be rented out. We then saw Herman Mashaba coming in as mayor, and then the DA administration. Again, it was in 2016 December that he brought it out. He was then accused also, there were sentiments of xenophobia as well that came in. There's all the nuances that come in here to play. We're almost 7-8 years later. The response from Gauteng government is almost the same, saying we have a plan for economic viability. We know that. We know that there is this plan, but can we see implementation? And I think that blame game affects the most vulnerable on the ground. Also, what is concerning is that building that we saw being burnt was leased out, to the social development, to an NGO that was going to house abandoned women, these vulnerable women and children that needed spaces. There was a clinic that apparently was opened up and was available there. That then was closed down due to vandalism. And now that, for whatever reasons that NGO was then abandoned, these women don't have any spaces. This building that get hijacked once again. And these are all cause for concerns, that we have issues around, gender-based violence. And we need, layered responses to this. It can't be just one. We need, an issue. And we've heard from Gauteng government that everyone should come to party now, and each one sit around. We're in a coalition right now that each party brings, their concerns, but also for NGOs that want to speak on human rights and want to bring in that vulnerable groups to also come to the party.
You also alluded to the emotional weekend that lies ahead. Perhaps as more families come and identify bodies, really take in what's happened, try to salvage and make sense of what's occurred. We'll monitor developments, and obviously you'll keep us posted. But thank you for that update. Hasina Gori was on the ground in Joburg CBD, just assessing the impact of the ripple effects to date of the inferno that obviously struck the area, the building, and where to from here.